For 9 years, a bull waited faithfully at a train station, but what it was waiting for broke everyone's heart. What happens next will leave you speechless. The train pulled into Belmere Junction with a tired groan, its whistle slicing through the early morning fog like a blade through silk. The 610 from Dunwich was rarely full, and this morning was no different. Only a few passengers stepped off into the chilled platform air, boots echoing dully against the concrete. But one figure didn't move like the others. He stepped out slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure of the ground beneath him. His eyes were fixed not on the station, not on the people, but on something ahead, something large, unmoving, and terrifyingly familiar. Callum Hurst stood still, breath fogging the air, his heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. 20 yards away, just past the yellow line, stood a massive bull, its coat deep black with a strange burn mark along its side, like scorched leather, and a half-moon scar above its right eye. The beast didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Monarch. The name echoed in Callum's mind like a curse he hadn't spoken in years. The bull took a single step forward, hooves clicking on the frost-covered platform. Callum didn't run. He didn't speak for several seconds. His gloved hands trembled slightly as he exhaled. "So you're still here," he said finally, his voice low, brittle. The bull stopped, head tilted just slightly, ears flicking at the sound of his voice. There was no recognition in Monarch's eyes, only stillness, watchfulness. But for Callum, the guilt came flooding back, roaring in his ears louder than the engine still hissing behind him. He forced himself to walk, not toward Monarch, but past him, toward the exit. The locals had started to glance, a few station workers whispering, curious. Monarch never reacted to anyone, not for 9 years. But this morning, he had moved. Callum didn't check into a hotel. He went straight to Belmere Auto and Timber on Ashworth Street, the only garage in town. The mechanic on duty, a lanky young man with oil-stained fingers and wild hair tucked under a knit cap, barely looked up as Callum entered. "I'm looking for Glenn Reeve," Callum said. The mechanic blinked, confused. "You're a little late for that, friend." "How late?" 8 years. Died in a barn fire, up at Gavin Ranch." Callum's shoulders stiffened. He gave a silent nod and walked out without a word. The cold wind cut sharper now. 8 years. The timeline didn't fit neatly, but the coincidence was too loud to ignore. Monarch had shown up at the station almost exactly after that fire. As he walked the sloped street toward the town center, he caught his own reflection in the bakery window. Older, thinner, shadows under the eyes that hadn't left since the files first landed on his desk back in Grenthorpe. He'd buried those files, locked them deep in the encrypted folders of a burned laptop. He'd promised himself he was done. But Monarch's eyes wouldn't let him forget. Belmere Town Hall stood across from the square, a squat stone building with paint chipping along the edges of the wooden door. Inside, the air was warm but smelled of old paper and older decisions. A clerk sat behind a desk, his spectacles low on his nose, frowning at a ledger. "I'm researching livestock ownership in the area," Callum said, trying to sound casual. "Specifically from about 9 to 10 years back. Something to do with Gavin Ranch." The clerk raised a brow. "Gavin Ranch hasn't been active in a decade. The fire destroyed most of the records." "But not all," Callum said, holding his gaze. Eventually, the clerk sighed and led him to a back storage room lined with shelves. It was quiet there, the only sounds the distant creaking of old wood and the rustle of folders being flipped. After an hour of sifting, Callum found a half-collapsed box near the bottom shelf. Its label read, "Gavin Ranch, disbanded." Inside were scattered documents, some half-burned, others stained with smoke. Amid the chaos, he pulled free a photograph, its edges curled with time. In it stood a young boy, no older than 10, arm slung affectionately around Monarch's neck. Both were facing the camera, though their eyes pointed slightly past the lens, toward something unseen, something just outside the frame. Callum's breath caught. He turned the photo over. In faded handwriting were the words, "For everything you did, we forgive you." He stared at it for a long time, the weight of it sinking into his bones. The words weren't meant for him, not directly, but they still landed like a hammer to the chest. Forgiveness. The one thing he never asked for. The one thing he didn't believe he deserved. His thumb brushed the bottom of the photo, smudging the ink slightly. "You shouldn't," he whispered, voice raw. His hands shook as he slid the photo back into the box and stood. The room seemed colder now. The light from the window had faded, casting everything in a dull blue. Callum walked out of the archive with slow, heavy steps, the sound of his boots echoing off the stone. Back at the station, Monarch had returned to his usual place, platform 2, near the edge. His eyes were closed, but his body remained perfectly still, like a statue carved from night. Callum didn't approach him again. Not yet. He sat on the bench instead, the same one where commuters waited every morning. He watched Monarch, watched the way the bull's ears twitched at every distant sound, every rumble of an approaching train, every whistle lost in the wind. He remembered the files from the Gavin Ranch project, the ones labeled non-human trials and emotion transference models. He remembered the name of the boy in those files, Evan. He hadn't known the boy personally, but the project details were clear. The animal had been bonded to him, impossibly so. More than a subject, more than a pet, a protector, maybe even something closer to a brother. Then one day, the boy disappeared, and the files stopped. Callum closed his eyes. His own role in those decisions hadn't been direct, but he hadn't stopped them either. He'd signed off on clearance forms, turned blind eyes to questionable funding, moved approvals through channels that should have been blocked. It was just paperwork to him back then, just procedure, until it wasn't, until Monarch. He watched the bull for another hour as dusk settled over Belmere. The lights above the platform flickered on, yellow and soft. Monarch didn't move. He simply stood watch, like he had for nearly a decade. As Callum rose to leave, he looked once more at the scar above Monarch's eye, the mark of a fire long past. He thought of Glen Reeve, of Evan, of the secrets buried in smoke and silence. He thought of the words on that photograph. He walked back to his room above the station, heart heavy, steps slow. Tomorrow he would return to the ruins of Gavin Ranch. He would find what was left, if anything. But tonight, he stared out the small attic window, watching the moonrise reflect off the metal rails. He clenched the photo once more, fingers white around its edges, and whispered again into the quiet, "You shouldn't." Callum cracked open the brittle ledger under the dim library bulb, his eyes scanning faded ink and water-stained pages. A layer of dust lifted with each turn, stinging his throat, but he kept reading. The quiet of the Belmere Town Hall archives was disturbed only by the faint ticking of a wall clock and the occasional creak of floorboards above. His fingers were smudged with charcoal-gray ink, and a pile of scattered records lay around him like fallen leaves. Each entry told part of the story: land purchases, livestock registries, federal inspections. But none of it explained why a genetically enhanced bull stood waiting at a train station for nearly a decade. Every evening, Callum returned to Platform 2 and sat beside Monarch. The bull was a silent guardian, unmoving and alert, his breath thick in the frosted air. Callum would speak in hushed tones, asking questions that had no answers, muttering memories from a life that had unraveled the moment he'd uncovered his first military leak. Passers-by began noticing the strange man talking to the bull, but no one interrupted. Most were too afraid. Monarch had never harmed anyone, but his presence was too solemn, too focused. It felt sacred, almost unnatural. One night, as snow dusted the wooden benches, and the last train groaned away into the distance, a shadow approached from behind the station's storage shed. An old man shuffled closer, his footsteps slow but sure. He wore a long maintenance coat and carried a flashlight that barely worked. Callum didn't react until the man sat beside him on the cold bench. "I remember that bull," the man said, voice raspy but steady. "Belonged to a boy named Evan. Kindest soul I ever knew." Callum turned, startled. The man held out his hand. "Fen Lowry. Janitor here since '94. Saw Monarch follow that boy around like a dog. Never seen anything like it." Callum's chest tightened. "You knew Evan?" "I knew of him," Fen replied, leaning on his cane. "He lived up at Gavin Ranch. Used to wave at the train every morning. Quiet kid, but always smiling. Then one day, he stopped coming. Fire took the barn. No one said much. Then the bull showed up here not long after." Callum studied Monarch, who hadn't moved an inch. "Do you remember who ran Gavin Ranch?" "Some fellow named Glen Reeve, passed years ago. His ranch was under some kind of contract, though. Lots of suits came and went. Wasn't normal." Callum nodded slowly, mind spinning. "Halver and Knox?" Fenn's brow furrowed. "Yeah, that's the name. Military types, always pretending to be feed inspectors." Callum stood. "Thank you," he said quietly. Fenn tipped his cap and limped away into the snow. Callum remained there for another hour, not speaking. His gloved hand slowly moved to Monarch's foreleg, the left one. He knelt, brushing the fur aside until he felt it. A hard, circular bump under the skin. He pulled a small pocket scanner from his coat. It beeped faintly. Embedded under the hide was a metal disc, no larger than a coin. He stepped back, breath shaky. He had seen that disc before, in a classified document buried inside a leaked file. It was part of the Red One program. Animal cognition, empathy bonding, behavioral weaponization. And it wasn't just theory. Monarch had been part of it. The next day, Callum accessed his old hard drive, tucked inside a fireproof bag buried in a storage locker outside Belmere. He sifted through dozens of encrypted folders, finally opening a set labeled Project Harlan, Red One Trials. The documents detailed biometric stats, test cycles, and ethical violations redacted beyond comprehension. But the metadata was untouched. Coordinates. Callum copied the numbers into his notebook and set out before sunset. He followed the old gravel road that led past the outskirts of town and into the dead hills surrounding the ruins of Gavin Ranch. The land had been left untouched since the fire. Overgrown grass choked the fence line. The air smelled of rust and old ash. The barn was barely standing. Blackened beams leaned like tired soldiers. Callum climbed over a fallen door and stepped inside. Moonlight filtered through broken rafters, casting streaks of silver on scorched hay and scattered tools. He traced the interior, tapping the floorboards until he heard a hollow thump. Beneath a warped plank, he found a rusted metal ring. He pulled it. A square trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow shaft with iron rungs descending into darkness. The air inside was still, cold and metallic. Callum climbed down slowly, flashlight in his mouth. At the bottom was a small sealed chamber. The door was reinforced steel, but old. He pushed hard until it groaned open. The room had survived the fire completely. It was lined with filing cabinets and observation equipment. On the far wall was a row of old monitors, long dead. A series of binders sat on the central table. Callum opened them with trembling fingers. Subject read 1. Each report matched Monarch's vitals. The notes described enhanced neural mapping, target recognition, and emotional bonding experiments. Monarch had responded to only one handler. Subject Epsilon 7, a boy named Evan Reeve. As Callum turned to the final binder, his throat tightened. The last entry read, Subject has bonded beyond command protocols. Child exhibits uncontrollable attachment. Project integrity compromised. Removal authorized. Termination pending. Callum stepped back, heart pounding. His mouth went dry. They didn't lose Evan in the fire. They removed him. They erased him because Monarch had grown too attached, because love had gotten in the way of control. Callum backed into the far wall, sliding down until he was seated on the cold floor. His voice cracked as he whispered, They killed him because Monarch loved him. He stayed in the bunker until dawn, copying files, photographing evidence. His hands never stopped shaking. By sunrise, he marched into the magistrate's office and demanded to see Alric Dane, the town's acting legal officer. The young clerk tried to stall, but the urgency in Callum's voice broke through. I have proof of government-backed trials on children, Callum said through clenched teeth, and I have names. Either I speak with Dane, or this goes national right now. Dane agreed to a private meeting. Callum laid the photos, files, and Monarch's embedded tag on the desk. Dane flipped through them, expression unreadable. He promised to escalate the case. 3 hours later, the magistrate's office caught fire. Callum stood outside with a crowd of stunned townsfolk as smoke rose into the gray sky. Fire engines roared up the street. Nothing was salvaged. Everything had burned. He ran, back to the station. But when he reached Platform 2, Monarch was gone. The bench was empty. No hoofprints in the dirt, no breath in the air. Just silence. Panic surged in Callum's chest. He turned in circles, scanning the station, the tracks, the nearby streets. Nothing. He asked every worker. No one had seen the bull leave. No trains had passed. No trailers had pulled in. It was as if Monarch had vanished into thin air. Callum walked to the bench and sat, slowly lowering himself, dazed. His mind raced. Someone had silenced the magistrate's office. Someone had taken Monarch, or worse. The wind picked up. In his coat pocket, the photograph of Evan and Monarch crinkled. His fingers brushed the folded corner. They killed him because Monarch loved him. The tracks ended at the edge of the gorge. Callum's breath came in short bursts, white puffs vanishing into the icy wind. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved closer to the edge, following the hoofprints that had dragged him up here since before dawn. Monarch stood motionless just 10 feet away, his massive frame framed against the fog-drenched drop. The bull's breath steamed into the cold air, his head slightly lowered, not in aggression, but in thought. Something about the way he was standing unnerved Callum. Monarch wasn't grazing. He wasn't looking for a path. He was staring, straight down. Below the cliff, the sharp turn in the freight rail curved through the ravine like a scar on the landscape. Pine Cliff Gorge. Callum had heard the name growing up, mostly in hushed voices, the way old folks talked about haunted places. Years ago, trains used to derail here so often it had become local legend. No one talked about it anymore. Until now. Callum stepped forward cautiously. Monarch? He called softly. The bull twitched an ear but didn't move. Then, from behind a weathered pine near the cliff's edge, a man emerged. Callum stopped cold. The stranger was in his 50s, broad-shouldered but worn down by years. His face was gaunt, his eyes sharp. He wore a heavy work coat, and stitched on the shoulder was a faded but unmistakable patch. Halver and Knox Bioresearch. Callum's heart pounded. He stepped instinctively between the man and Monarch. "Who are you?" The man didn't flinch. "Name's Dalton Krell," he said calmly, as if he were introducing himself over a coffee table. "I worked the Red One project back in 2008. You're Evan's brother, aren't you?" Callum's jaw tightened. "You knew Evan?" Dalton gave a small, joyless smile. "Better than you did." The wind howled through the gorge, the sound almost swallowing Dalton's voice. Callum took another step forward, squinting through the fog. "You followed him here," Callum said, motioning toward Monarch. "Why?" Dalton shrugged. "To finish what we started." Callum's fists clenched. "You mean the project? The one you shut down right after Evan died?" Dalton's eyes narrowed. "He didn't just die." Silence. Callum didn't speak. The cold in his chest wasn't from the weather anymore. Dalton looked toward Monarch, who had shifted slightly, his breath heavy now, the muscles along his flank rippling beneath his thick coat. Dalton stepped closer to the edge, arms crossed. "Evan was a bright kid," he said. "He figured out more in 2 months than our team had in 2 years. We were researching neural stabilizers, doping the bulls with chemical blends to suppress their natural aggression, made them docile, predictable, easier to manage, cheaper to feed. But Evan..." Dalton's voice slowed. He saw something different in Monarch. The compound affected them both. "What do you mean, them both?" Callum asked. Dalton glanced at him like it should be obvious. "We weren't just experimenting on livestock. Halver and Knox was trying to map the neural responses of empathy, figure out if it could be transferred, trained, injected." Monarch and Evan bonded. Dalton didn't blink. "The board made a decision. We had too much invested. Evan wouldn't cooperate. He became a liability." Callum's voice cracked. "You're saying you murdered a child because he wouldn't let you keep torturing an animal?" Dalton's face hardened. "Don't pretend it was that simple. That boy stood in the way of a medical breakthrough. He made a choice. So did we." Behind them, Monarch let out a low, guttural noise, half breath, half warning. The sound sent chills up Callum's spine. Dalton turned toward the bull, amused. "Looks like he remembers." In a way that disrupted the entire framework. The boy wouldn't let us separate them. Wouldn't let us sedate the bull again. Callum stared. "So what? You killed him?" That's when Monarch moved. It happened fast. One moment he was standing still. The next, his hooves tore through the snow and gravel as he charged. Callum yelled out, instinctively reaching to stop him, but it was too late. Monarch's horn caught Dalton square in the ribs, lifting him off his feet. Dalton screamed, flailing backward. His coat snagged against Monarch's jagged horn, and both man and beast tumbled toward the cliff's edge. Monarch stopped at the rim, skidding to a halt with a shower of snow and stone. Dalton didn't. The scientist's body twisted midair, falling silently into the fog below. Then, nothing. No scream, no sound, only the wind. Monarch backed away from the edge, his breathing heavy, steam rolling from his nostrils. He turned toward Callum and walked to his side. Callum stood frozen, heart racing, eyes wide with disbelief. He dropped to one knee, running a hand along Monarch's neck. The bull didn't flinch. Then Callum remembered. 2 nights ago he'd noticed the same vehicle, an unmarked truck, idling near the station. He had a feeling Monarch was being tracked, so he rigged a motion-activated trail cam to one of the trees near Pinecliff's outer ridge. He turned his eyes toward that same tree now, barely visible in the fog. He sprinted to it. The device was intact. Its red light blinked slowly. Recording. He checked the footage. Everything. It had captured everything. Callum didn't wait. He tore back down the ridge with Monarch close behind, taking every shortcut he could remember through the woods. By dusk, they reached the highway where Callum had stashed his truck under an old tarp. He loaded Monarch into the livestock trailer and drove straight to a freelance journalist he knew in the next city, Marvin Holt, a former war correspondent who now wrote exposés for underground media. Marvin watched the footage twice. "This is bigger than you think," he said, wiping his face. "This is going to burn down the whole research division." Callum nodded. "Then let it." But the fallout didn't go as expected. Marvin published the video within the hour. It spread like wildfire. Millions viewed it. Within 24 hours, it was the top trending story across 3 platforms. Hashtags erupted. Justice for Evan. Monarch knows. Halver exposed. But Halver and Knox responded differently. They issued a statement denying any connection to Dalton Krell or the Red One project. They called the video manipulated and deeply misleading. Then they filed a legal notice against Callum, threatening a gag order for violation of private property and slander. Callum didn't care. That night, he made the full footage public, uncut, raw, time-stamped, and released a personal statement alongside it. They silenced my brother. They won't silence this. He didn't sleep. By morning, reporters were camped outside his house. Protesters picketed the Halver and Knox labs. State officials issued formal requests for investigation, but no charges were filed. The company had legal shields miles thick, and Dalton's body was never recovered. Worse still, Halver labeled Monarch a national threat. They claimed the bull had been weaponized, citing dangerous behavioral anomalies and potential risks to public safety. A bounty was quietly issued. Tranquilizer teams were dispatched to capture or eliminate him. Callum packed his things. He couldn't let them take Monarch. Not again. Not after everything. They left just after midnight. No headlights, no GPS, just the stars and an old paper map of the backcountry routes no one used anymore. As the truck rolled deeper into the night, Monarch lay in the trailer behind him, calm, steady, and unafraid. He wasn't just a bull anymore. He was a witness, a creature that refused to forget. Callum and Monarch went into hiding. Monarch stood motionless beside the tracks, steam curling from his nostrils in the early morning chill. Fog clung low to the ground, turning the world to a smear of pale gray. Just behind him, the crumbling rail line carved a quiet path through the dense Eldon pines, forgotten by industry but not by memory. The towering bull's eyes were fixed on a single point in the distance, unmoving, unblinking. Callum watched from the cabin window, mug of black coffee in hand, his breath clouding the pain. He didn't speak. He never did on this day. Year after year, Monarch returned to this exact stretch of rusted track, always on the same date, always at the same hour, 6:10 a.m. He would stand there for hours, hooves planted like roots in the earth, scanning the horizon as though Evan might walk out from the fog and into his waiting gaze. But Evan never came, and still, Monarch waited. Callum opened the cabin door slowly. The hinges creaked, and the cold bit at his face as he stepped outside. His boots sank into the dew-soaked grass. Monarch didn't turn to acknowledge him. He never did on this day. "It's been 3 years, old friend," Callum said softly, his voice thick with a sorrow that hadn't dulled with time. He stepped closer, standing beside the bull now, shoulder to flank. Monarch towered over him like a monument. "I don't think he'd want you standing here forever." Monarch blinked once. A crow cawed in the distance. The forest was otherwise silent, holding its breath around them. They stayed like that until the sun pushed through the fog. Then, slowly, Monarch turned and walked back into the woods, his heavy steps deliberate and quiet. The rest of the year, the bull remained near the cabin. He'd built a den of sorts in a hollow beneath the cliffs by the river, a natural basin surrounded by mossy stone and thick brush. At night, Callum could sometimes hear him shifting in his sleep, huffing softly through his nose like he was chasing something in dreams. Callum rarely left the pines. The world beyond Belmere was loud, ruthless, and wired with too many eyes. But he hadn't gone into hiding out of fear. He was waiting, preparing. The data stick burned like a brand in his pocket. He'd spent months stealing fragments of the Red One archive before fleeing. 3 years, and he'd finally rebuilt enough of the files to make a move. It was time. That night, under the flickering glow of a single lantern, Callum inserted the drive into his laptop. Monarch lay outside the open window, silent but alert, as if he knew something was shifting. The cabin filled with the soft clicking of keys, the screen reflecting in Callum's eyes like firelight. The files were massive: blueprints, video logs, neural pattern maps, testimonies from Halver and Knox engineers who had since disappeared. One folder, marked Evan Unit 17 Final, stopped him cold. He hovered the cursor over it, heart pounding. Inside, video footage. The screen lit up with a grainy time-stamped feed. It showed Evan in the early days, just after his transfer to Unit 17's care. Monarch stood by his side in a cold metal pen, guarded but protective. Evan, tiny and trembling, held the bull's massive horn like it was a lifeline. The audio crackled. "He won't eat without Monarch nearby," a voice noted off camera. "Suggest we extend the trial pairing." Another file. Evan in a padded room, asleep. Monarch lay curled around him like a shield. Callum exhaled shakily. He copied the entire folder onto 3 encrypted USBs, then drafted the message he'd waited years to send. He hit send. By morning, the world had changed. The headline broke like a thunderclap. Red One exposed: illegal biotech trials, child fatalities, and corporate cover-up. News vans swarmed Belmere. Drones hovered over the forest. Halver and Knox stock plummeted in a single afternoon. By nightfall, 2 senators had resigned, and 3 biotech executives had gone dark. But no one came for Callum, no agents, no officers, no helicopters over the pines. He wasn't a threat anymore. Neither was Monarch. They were ghosts, shadows of a story too big to control, too terrible to deny. And for the first time in years, Callum felt the tightness in his chest begin to lift. A week later, he returned to Belmere. He didn't tell Monarch he was leaving. He didn't need to. The bull simply followed, his hooves quiet along the gravel path, like he had always known this was where the road would end. Belmere Junction had changed. The platform was still there, cracked, faded, but the rails were polished now. People came here, tourists, reporters, but no one stood long by Platform 2. Callum installed the memorial himself. It was a simple plaque, set in a stone base beside the tracks. The station manager tried to help, but Callum shook his head. He wanted to do this part alone, with his own hands. When he was done, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. Monarch stood beside him, silent. The plaque read, "To the one who waited, and the boy he never forgot." There was no ceremony, no cameras, just the low hum of the wind through the station and the distant whistle of the morning train. At 6:10 a.m., as the train passed through Belmere Junction, Monarch looked once more down the rails, just as he had every year, and then, without a sound, turned and walked into the woods. He did not look back. Callum stood there a long time after. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores the profound themes of loyalty, loss, and the enduring power of hope. This narrative aims to highlight the deep emotional bonds that can exist between humans and animals, inspiring empathy and a deeper appreciation for unconditional love.